Everyone. Welcome to my last class-specific tier list, at least until any major patches that may come out and shift balance for the characters around. I don't think anything that crazy will happen, but you never know. With this one at least, there's maybe a decent possibility, but the other ones I think are pretty safe. But this one, I am covering Marksman, finally. Now, the Marksmen are a bit of an interesting one because, as I think pretty much nearly all players know that have played the game to a decent extent, they've learned that Marksmen, not so great. They kind of fall off pretty hard after Act 1. I still personally think that they are usable in Act 2, but they get a little questionable near the end of Act 2, and then Act 3 and 4 are completely dead. Just completely. If you've been watching some of my other videos and build guides, you'll know that I have made two different types of builds for the end game with the Soul Merchant involving Marksman and gotten some pretty good results out of them. One of the builds is for pretty much any of the Marksmen, one is specifically for Sir Bors. And the Bors one is, I think, really good. There's going to be some very obvious subjectivity to this. When I place one in S tier, it doesn't mean this is a really good hero. You should always bring it on your team. I just mean I think this is probably the best marksman amongst them. But all of them, as it stands as a whole, are still not great, and you're probably not going to want to run one for Acts 3 and 4, depending on who you ask, most of Act 2, and even at Endgame, only if you invest a lot of soul fragments into buying their soul merchant gear. So just keep that in mind. I don't want people being like, what do you mean, Esther? This character sucks. They do no damage. I'm aware. Marksmen are not great. This is all compared to one another. Now, one other disclaimer I want to give is that the ranking of this would probably be a little different if I took into account the soul merchant gear, because there are some possibilities that open up and I think enable some of them a little more than others. And I'm not going to tier them off that. I've done every other tier list based off their skill tree, and I'm going to stay true to that, and that's how I'm going to rank them here. As I sort of mentioned earlier, what is an S tier marksman? I just think, as far as the marksmen go, this one is probably one of the stronger options they have. They just have some skills that make them more bearable, I suppose, if you were to choose to bring them between Acts 1 and Endgame. And they have some, at least, minor contribution that they're going to bring, even if they're not doing much damage. They're bringing something else that at least they don't feel like they're dead weight. A tier, this is a decent marksman. They have some utility. They do all right performance-wise compared to the others, just a bit above average, but still nothing that feels necessarily super great. B tier, very standard average marksman. Feel good in Act 1 if you were to use them in Act 1, and just don't feel good after that. And C tier, this marksman just somehow manages to end up being worse than the rest, just feels worse to use than the rest. There's just some sort of imbalance about them that seems to shine even harder than the others. I know those tier descriptions didn't sound great, but I'm just working with what I got here. Starting it off, we have Sir Bors, and Sir Bors is sort of an interesting one. He's the only marksman that can wear medium armor, so that's pretty cool. He's going to naturally be a bit tankier, more health, more armor, and one of the weaknesses of marksmen is the fact that they use light armor, and they don't have anything like magical armor that arcanists have that let them really help protect them from some of the initial hits in an encounter that may get thrown their way. So they're very vulnerable to getting sniped by enemy ranged units and just taking a bunch of damage. So Bors does have that going for him. He's just naturally a bit tankier. And a couple of his abilities that I think help him really sort of stand out is his Mark Target, which isn't great in the current setting of the game because it only applies a vulnerability debuff for ranged attacks. So that's either a second marksman or an arcanist, primarily at least. So it's good but fairly niche, but I do like his smothering shot, the fact that it can apply various kinds of debuffs, including silence, which is a very rare status effect. I think he's the only character that can apply silence, and that's just very good for really locking down enemy ranged units, preventing them from using abilities like their ranged stuns or blinds or just spells in general. So I really like that. Unfortunately, he does have the lazy trait, which means you can only bring him on 2 missions, which isn't a huge deal in the current state of the game because he's a marksman, but it's still not great. I think overall, he has some pros for him, he has some cons for him. I think he's a pretty good fit for the B tier. Next is Sir Damas. He's the Tyrant Christian marksman, and he's actually pretty good. I like him in endgame from what I've messed around with. I've messed around with all of them a little bit through the leveling process, so I kind of have an idea of how they feel as you're going through Acts 1 through 4. And not as much a fan of him for that part of the game. He has a couple things I like, but there is one major downside. He has Gas Trap in his skill tree, and Gas Trap is terrible. It's one of the worst skills in the game, in my opinion. You just never worth using. You're pretty much always better just using the AP to shoot someone. But what he does have going for him is he has an ability called Low Profile. This is usually a Vanguard ability that basically acts as a soft taunt towards everyone else in your party if he is not within a certain distance of any enemies, I think 6 tiles. So basically, he just won't be targeted by ranged enemies, which is really good because, as I mentioned before, marksmen can struggle with survivability due to being so squishy. And now the target on him is pretty much gone in most situations and just won't get attacked at all. And that's amazing for survivability. Probably one of the strongest, if not the strongest survivability passive for all of the marksmen. And on top of that, he has Crippling Shot, which is, I think, the strongest damage scaling ability out of the marksman skills. It's 150% weapon damage at base, I believe. So it's a good percentage amount, but it's marksman damage, unfortunately, and the bow scaling's not great. But for marksman damage, this is the highest single target damage you're going to get, so that's pretty good for them. And it also has a knockback, which can be useful, and a slow, which is also useful. So he has some really good things going for him, but I do think Gas Trap kind of sandbags him quite a bit to the point where I don't think he's quite S tier. I think there's another marksman that is a bit better than him and earns that spot away from him. I think if maybe he had Gas Trap replaced with something else, he could probably be an S tier too. Next is Lady Dindraine, the first marksman everyone gets really early on, and probably my go-to marksman for Act 1. She's just very versatile. She has Poison Arrow and Fire Arrow, which is actually kind of unique amongst the marksmen. Usually they only have one or the other. Most people usually having Poison Arrow. And beyond that, she's pretty standard for marksmen. There's nothing really, I think, that's in her kit that is worse than what other marksmen are going to have. It's just very sort of basic. And having Poison Arrow and Fire Arrow, I think, is a very good versatility in her offensive toolkit, especially early on when you're going against the Lost, and Poison Arrow isn't quite so good. So I think she's very average, and she goes in B tier. Next is Sir Geraint. He is the rightful Old Faith character, and he's actually pretty good in terms of utility and versatility for a marksman. He has Ice Shield, which is an incredibly powerful move, probably the best overall defensive skill, I think, in the game. The ability to just block 3 to 4 incoming attacks, most attacks at least, there are a couple things that bypass it, is just great. And again, marksman survivability, this does great for him, and his real shining ability in his toolkit, I think, is his Lightning Arrow. When he shoots this, it will chain to nearby targets within X distance of the initial target with this lightning damage and apply shock to the target as well as up to 3 other targets. I think I'm getting the numbers right. It's been a while since I've played with him, so if it's slightly off, sorry about that, but I'm like 99% sure it's 3 targets, so for 4 targets total, getting shock. And I think shock is one of the strongest debuffs in the game, especially if you're going against Fomorians. A lot of them have armor. Being able to just reduce AP by 50% with armor or 25% without is huge. And the way it targets enemies lets you reach a very large AoE of targets that can be affected by this and apply this debuff. It's definitely the strongest debuff and crowd control ability amongst all of the marksmen. And because marksman damage isn't good right now, I think that makes this usefulness and this utility in the debuff that much more important that it's a part of his kit. So because he just has this usefulness, he can still bring even if it isn't that much for damage. I think it puts him into S tier as far as the marksmen go. Like I said, none of their damage is great from Acts 2 through 4. So the fact that he can still be useful in the form of debuffing, and you don't have to worry about keeping him alive very much because his ice shields do most of that for him, it doesn't feel bad bringing him. Like, he's still going to be contributing something. And lastly, we have Sir Yvain, and I don't like him. He has assassination, which is good for damage dealing, and theoretically could help boost his damage dealing to not be so bad compared to the other marksmen, but it's just kind of too little, I think. It doesn't do enough to really make his damage stand out to compensate for his downsides. And the downsides are that his unique abilities to him just suck. He has Fire Arrow, which only Dindraine shares with him, and that's okay, but then we have Piercing Shot, which is just terrible. The damage is abysmal, even for marksmen, I feel like. And it's a line attack, so you can hit multiple enemies, but the damage is so low, I'd 9 times out of 10 just shoot one person for more damage than hitting 3 people for shitty damage. And then in tier 3, instead of Poison Bomb, he has Rain of Arrows, which is a higher damage AoE, which is good, but the AP cost on it is so absurdly high. Again, I would just rather shoot one person for a moderate amount of damage than hit a group of 3 people for not good damage. And then that's my entire turn if I use Rain of Arrows, because the cost is so high. So because 2 of the unique abilities to him are just basically dead skills, like, I never use them. I'm not sure how many people that mess with Yvain have bothered to use them either. I don't think anyone likes Piercing Shot. I just don't see why he isn't in C tier. At least every other character has abilities that are useful, and if you're going to bring this marksman, you're going to be using those abilities of theirs that are unique to them. Yvain is the only one where it's like, hey, I have these 2 skills that only I have. Yeah, okay, cool. We're not going to use those. So, yeah, it's just not great. So now this is my tier list for marksmen if you're going to choose to use them in the story from Acts 1 to 4, and I guess into endgame as well, ignoring the Soul Merchant gear. Because, like I said at the beginning, I think this is the fair way to do it. I did every other class without taking into account any sort of gear combinations they could potentially get. However, I do think that the Soul Merchant gear is so impactful for them. I am going to do a quick reorganization of this. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time going into reasoning and stuff because I don't want to stretch this out too long, but I do just want to sort of briefly present the different order I think it'll have based on the honestly game-changing relics they get access to in the endgame. Be right back. Okay, and I am back, and you can see I've done a little bit of reorganizing, and as just a way to preface this, all of them, I think, are actually very usable and fun and even good to use in endgame if you load them up on the Soul Merchant gear. Yvain is still in C tier, but that's just because even with the gear, you're still not really going to be using Piercing Shot and Rain of Arrows a whole lot. He is still more efficient, I think, using Fire Arrow and regular shoot, and Assassination does become much more useful here, but I just think compared to the other marksmen, he's just not as good. I'll be honest too, haven't used him nearly as much as the other ones, so maybe I'm off base and just haven't realized how much of a boost Assassination offers for him. If I am underestimating it, then I guess maybe he'd move up to B and Dindraine would maybe drop to C, because Dindraine is definitely just staying here because she's the most generic of them. Nothing really crazy going on for her. She's like kind of what I use as the baseline. Now, I think Geraint drops down to A. He does still have good utility, but because the damage capability does become a lot higher with Marksman and the Soul Merchant pieces, and with the Soul Merchant relics, Damas and his crippling shot becomes a much bigger deal, I think. And his low profile is just really great for you to just dash past enemies, go into their backline, put them completely out in the open. But because of low profile, he'll just never be targeted, so he's just getting free shots every single round and getting that crippling shot off for some pretty good nukes. And because of the higher damage potential, I do think it does outscale Geraint's sort of debuff and crowd control utility that he still has. Now, Boars, I think, is sort of the undisputed top of S tier and the best marksman in the game once you've reached endgame and got the soul gear. If you've seen my build I did for him, the damage he puts out is just so much higher than all of the other marksmen because of the medium armor soul relic that he gets that reduces all range skill AP cost by 1. He just gets so many extra attacks in comparison to everyone else that the damage just it's such a large gap that there's no way he is not at the top of S tier. And with both versions of this tier list sort of concluded, that will wrap it up for this video. I'm pretty confident in where I placed all of them. Like I said, the only one I'm a little iffy on is maybe Yvain once you reach the end game, because I haven't really used him a whole lot there. I'm just not a fan of his. I think he's lame. So if someone else has a different experience with him, please let me know in the comments. I'd very much like to hear if someone's managed to turn him into some sort of crazy killing machine because of assassination once they get to the end game. If you were crazy enough to hold on to him for that long. As always, thanks for watching.